When school fails, unschool. To live is to learn. I'm Mary, and this is my son Luke. Luke does amazing things because his education is unscripted and driven by him. He learns through life experiences. And given love and freedom, he soars. Welcome to the Luke life, where complex, beautiful, gifted, Aspie minds play. This episode is concerning meningeal worms. So before we get into the video, I wanted to sort of send out a message to anyone who may be watching this that if you live in the eastern, especially northeastern part of the United States, and you're now in the fall to winter and you're seeing neurologic signs in your goats, your sheep, your camelids, like your alpacas, camels, llamas, then you need to be looking out for this disease, the meningeal worm that comes from the white-tailed deer. And for those of you that are going to bail and not be able to watch the whole video, just so you know, the treatment for meningeal worm is 50 mg per kg of fenbendazole orally for 5 days. And your choice of an anti-inflammatory, either Banamine, that's a non-steroidal, or a steroid like Dex-SP. And then the last thing that you need to look out for is if there's a secondary infection. So if your animal has a fever, there's a chance it has a secondary bacterial infection, and it may be in the central nervous system, so you have to find an antibiotic that can penetrate that central nervous system, and I used a 3rd generation cephalosporin. So I'm a small animal vet, not a large animal vet, so I'm slowly learning the different things in large animal, and this is my fault for not deworming him appropriately. I thought that my goat was, fine not being really dewormed because he only lives with one other goat and there's nothing else around, but silly me, it's like we have thousands of goats around with the deer that are around here, so my bad. So initially my goat signs were he was limping on his left front leg, and initially I thought, okay, it's just lameness. And then I started to notice that he started actually dragging the toe, so I said, oh wow, it's either in his shoulder or he has some sort of nerve damage. And then after that, he was starting to be lethargic, and then he started having weakness in the right front leg. And then I said, whoa, all right, this is neurologic, that's not good. And immediately I went and took his temperature, he had a fever, and then I got antibiotics in him, dewormer in him, anti-inflammatory in him. And then thought maybe it was a mycotoxin or listeria because he had gotten into some moldy feed around that time as well. And then I started to actually research about what the differentials would be for his clinical signs. And I really just want this to be a word of caution for all goat and sheep owners or other ungulates, any other mammal who has hooves in the area of northeastern America right now in the late summer, fall, or early winter, especially when there's been a lot of rainfall and there hasn't been a lot of cold frost yet to kill off the parasites on the ground. Alpine is an 8-month-old male castrated alpine goat. We call a castrated male goat a wether, and he started to develop signs of left front limb lameness a week or so ago. And I thought he was just lame, like maybe he stepped on something or we heard him when he was pulling the cart. So I examined him and I just could not get any pain out of that left front leg. And I was getting frustrated with myself because normally I'm very good at diagnosing lameness. And I'm like, I cannot tell where this is coming from. It looks neurologic. And I thought, oh gosh, maybe we damaged his nerve in his shoulder when we were having him pull the cart. So I gave him some anti-inflammatory, but then I noticed, like in this video, you'll see that it's more than just his left front leg. He is weaker, he's ataxic, which means he kind of wobbles back and forth, can't really keep his feet very well, he can fall over easily. And Then gradually, too, it started progressing to the back legs, weakness, and ataxia. So at this point, in my mind, like, okay, it's definitely something that's systemic. So do we have some sort of infection going on? Is it that parasitic? Is it viral? Is it bacterial? I took his temperature and I noticed that he has a fever, so it was 104.5. And so I gave him an antibiotic, gave him a 3rd generation cephalosporin, ceftiofur, also known as Exceed for horses. And then the next day the fever had gone away. But still made me question, what is this? So also at the same time, I dewormed him with Panicure. If there is going to be a parasite within the central nervous system, we're going to have to use something strong that can penetrate that. So I used Panicure, also known as fenbendazole, and it's at a much higher dose for anything that's inside the central nervous system. So typically it's around 5 to 10 milligrams per kilogram, but to get into the central nervous system and to kill those types of parasites, you're going to have to go up to 50 milligrams per kilogram for 5 days. So after giving him all these treatments, I was able to buy some time to then research what this could possibly be. The one thing I do want to note, that probably in the summer, midsummer, I did notice he had this weird thick skin on the sides of his neck, both sides, and there was hair loss. And I wasn't quite sure what it was. I'm like, okay. And then it, went away and the hair started to grow back. So if you look closely in this video, you can see on either sides of his neck where the hair is shorter, and that's where this was. And it's important to note that because I think a lot of experienced sheep and goat owners and camels and llamas and alpacas and also large animal vets would have been like, at that point, oh, he has meningeal worm. So very important, the skin lesions. So my presumptive diagnosis for Alpine is meningeal worm with a secondary bacterial infection in the central nervous system. Presumptive means I assume that's what it is because I'm not able to get a definitive diagnosis, a firm diagnosis. So now let's get into parasitology and how we group different types of parasites, and then we'll get into the actual meningeal worm life cycle and symptoms and treatment. Parasites are grouped into 3 different groups. You have arthropods, protozoans, and helminths. Arthropods are things like the fleas, the flies, the ticks, and the mites. And the protozoans are things like Giardia, Coccidia, Cryptosporidia, Toxoplasma, Babesia, malaria. And the helminths are everything else, all the other worms, so trematodes, cestodes, and nematodes. Trematodes are things like the liver fluke or lung fluke, Schistomiasis. Then we have cestodes, which are all sorts of tapeworms. And then the last one is nematodes. So those are hookworms, roundworms, heartworms, whipworms, lungworm, and meningeal worm. So now we're going to go over the nematode life cycle. So I just need to pause here for a second. So it's kind of funny that now I'm having to deal with parasitism and learning all the ins and outs of it to be able to diagnose it and treat it properly, because in vet school my worst subject was parasitology. I hated it, and I was like, when am I ever going to need this? I'm going to be a specialist, and this doesn't really matter to me. And especially large animals, I'm like, I just want to be a small animal vet. And it came back to bite me in the booty, because now I'm having to deal with it, and now I'm having a really huge problem with one of my goats. And it goes to show you that don't say that you'll never need something or do something, just learn it. Okay, so parasites are super sneaky and evolved, and it's pretty amazing how they actually work. And a lot of you would think, okay, there's these worms, they lay eggs, and then they turn into larvae, and then they just turn into adult again. Well, it's much more complicated than that, and it's, like I said, amazing what they can do. So usually for the nematodes, you have the adults. They lay eggs, and then they turn into larvae, where there's 4 different stages of larvae, and you'll see that with the L1, 2, 3, and 4. And they have to go through all of those stages to then become adults. So I would let's say most, not all, of the nematodes require a intermediate host, which means they need more than just one host to develop their full life cycle to turn into adults and lay eggs. The exception to that would be maybe roundworms, where, roundworms, the worms get in the dog or the cat or whatever, and then the worm lays eggs, then the animal comes back and eats the larva or their eggs, and it goes back through. But in the other ones, you need an intermediate host. Okay, so treatment can be tricky as well, because some antiparasitics only kill the adults, or only kill the eggs, or only kill the larva, or they can't get into certain body systems. So you really have to know a lot about what stage the parasite is in and where it is in the body. The primary host is the animal that is typically infected by this parasite, and it's also able to allow the parasite to go through its full life cycle, meaning it makes fertile adults who can lay eggs. So in this example of the meningeal worm, the primary host is the white-tailed deer. The intermediate host, like I said, most of the time is needed for the parasite to reach full sexual maturity to be able to lay the eggs. And so they could be a small mammal, they could be a snail or a slug, but they have to go through that host so that they can develop their full life cycle. In our example of the meningeal worm, the intermediate host here is a snail or a slug. And then you have the aberrant hosts. So these are the hosts that the parasite doesn't intentionally infect. They don't really want to infect these hosts because they're not going to be able to produce their offspring in these hosts, because the hosts are going to die and the worm never develops into an adult. So these are kind of like innocent bystanders, and they usually are affected way more severely than the primary hosts. The primary hosts usually aren't affected so bad because the goal for the parasite is to not kill your hosts. You just want them to be able to be there so that you can do your job and make your eggs. And in the example of the meningeal worm, the aberrant hosts are things like goats, sheep, llamas, alpacas, camels, moose, elk, caribou, guinea pigs, and rarely cattle and horses. Alright, so let's bring all of this together. So the meningeal worm, also known as Paralaphostrongylis tenuis, or P. tenuis, is a nematode, which is a helminth, and its primary host is deer, and the intermediate host is a snail or a slug, and the aberrant hosts are all those other animals I listed previously, but we're going to focus on my goat. So learning about life cycles of parasites can be pretty boring, so I hope this one isn't as boring. So we're going to do the life cycle of the meningeal worm. So first we have the adult worm in the brain, or in the meninges of the deer. Then it lays the eggs, and then the eggs transform into the first stage of the larva, L1. And then those L1 migrate down the neck into the lungs. And after that, they're coughed up and then swallowed by the deer. So now the L1 stage is in the intestinal system, or digestive system, I should say. And then the larvae are pooped out. So L1 is in the poop of the deer. And then there's a little snail or a slug that crawls across the poop. And then the larva L1 stage goes up into the snail or slug's foot. And then it transforms into an L2 and then L3 within the snail or slug. The L2 stage can only be found in the snail or slug. And then the deer inadvertently eats the snail or slug with the L3 larva in it. And then the L3 larvae are in the digestive system. And then they migrate up to the neck, into the brain, where they develop into adults again. And now is where the aberrant host comes into place. So a goat or sheep or camel can inadvertently eat the snail that has the L3 larva in it. So then the L3 larvae get into the digestive tract, and then they migrate from the digestive tract up the neck and up into the brain and spinal cord of the aberrant host. So the aberrant host can either die, or it can be permanently left with some neurologic damage, or we can treat it and try to prevent death. But if we're already starting to see neurologic signs, then most likely those signs are not going to get better, but we're going to be able to stop the progression to paralysis and then death. Well, at least we hope. And also, it's important to know that you want to give this treatment maybe a month or so to see if it has any improvement or cessation of the progression of the clinical signs. And then after that point, you can kind of assume that, hey, my animal's not going to get better, and it's time to put it down. The diagnosis of this parasite is what's called a clinical diagnosis. So we're going off the clinical signs, where we live in the United States or the world, and what time of year it is, and when the animal got infected, and just the course of the disease. We can't have a definitive diagnosis because the only way to do that is after the animal dies and send it to necropsy so they can find the worms or larvae within the spinal cord or brain. So the clinical signs of the meningeal worm are lameness, weakness, ataxia, lethargy, toe dragging, so they drag their foot when they walk. Their hoof folds under and they drag it. Circling blindness, loss of fear, nystagmus, which is inadvertent eye movement. And one of the earlier signs is that hair loss that can be noticed on the flank or the neck near the shoulder on the animal, and the skin is sort of thicker and it's itchy. And also paralysis and eventually death. So when an animal is sick, you have to be a detective and think of all the different things that could possibly be causing these clinical signs. So you not only have to look at the animal's clinical signs, but especially in large animal, you have to think about the husbandry of the animal, how they're fed, what minerals they have. You have to look at where they live in the United States, what season it is. And one of the things that we have to really keep our eye on is rabies. I mean, these clinical signs that Alpine has could be rabies. The one thing with rabies is that typically once they start showing clinical signs, they're going to be dead within the next 10 days. And that's why if any of you have been in the situation where you need to quarantine your animal for 10 days because they bit someone, it's because if they were rabid at that point when they bit someone, they'd be dead within 7 days, and you would know the animal most likely, or not most likely, but could have rabies, and then you examine the brain. So when I first realized that Alpine did have neurologic symptoms, I was very cautious, and I did wear gloves with him so that I didn't contract rabies, and also I didn't let the kids help me with him in the beginning. Rabies is no joke. You don't want to get it. The other differential that I have for Alpie's signs are CAE, and I won't go into all of this because there's just so much information, but CAE is caprine arthritis encephalitis, meaning it has inflammation in joints and the brain. So the next differential I look at are prions. So prions are things like chronic wasting disease that we see in deer, scrapie. The next group of differentials that I would think about would be bacterial. So is this a secondary infection to something? Is there infection in the brain and the lungs? Endotoxemia, so overeating disease. Listeriosis also comes when they eat some moldy food, and listeria could be in there. Tetanus, CLA. And again, I won't go into all of these, it's a lot. The next one we have to think about is there a husbandry issue. So is there a vitamin deficiency, like with thiamine or copper? And then there's toxicity, so things like lead or plants or mycotoxin from eating moldy foods. Also, tetanus technically would be in here, even though a bacteria causes it, but it's the toxin from the bacteria that is causing the actual problem. Same with endotoxemia. And then we have to have the old parasites on our list always. So that's where we have meningeal worm. And this list of differentials is definitely not all inclusive. They're sort of the ones that popped in my head first. So a lot of these things you really can't test for. I mean, you could if you want to spend a lot of money or call your animal and then send it to necropsy. So typically what you're stuck with is treating the animal presumptively. So you're going to give it different types of medications to cover different types of illnesses. So like with Alpie, I gave him an antibiotic because he was neurologic and he had a fever. I also gave him a dewormer. I gave him fenbendazole. And lastly, I gave him an anti-inflammatory because, you know, any sort of infectious agent within him causes inflammation, especially in the spinal cord and brain. So anti-inflammatories definitely help. So you have the choice of a steroid or a non-steroidal. I think sometimes that steroids work better when their infection or whatever is in the central nervous system, so I decided to give him a steroid. But you have to be careful because steroids do suppress the immune system, so it decreases the animal's immune system to be able to fight whatever infection is coursing. Okay, so here's how you figure out dosing for fenbendazole. The other thing that you should remember is if one member in your herd has a parasite, that you should really treat for the parasite in every animal in your herd. So Marigold is also going to get the treatment. That you can think about this is these dosages here are for a dose of 5 mg per kg. So it says the animal's body weight and how many mLs you give. So we're doing 50 mg per kg. So essentially you can multiply these numbers over here by 10 and then you'll get the amount for this chart. So 25-pound animal would get 6 mLs. Go all the way down to 125 pound animal would get 29 mLs.
Okay. Alpie.
Okay, so now we get to prevention, which I missed. So you can do a natural method or via chemicals. The natural method that I was using and didn't continue using was Molly's Herbal Dewormer, and it comes in 2 formulas, and it's essentially a weekly treatment year-round, or perhaps just in the peak season where you know these parasites are most prevalent, which would be August through November where we live in Maryland. So how this works is during week 1 you use Formula 1 for 3 days, and then the weeks 2 through 8 you would use Formula 2 once a week. If the goat is pregnant, then you would only use Formula 2 once a week. And I don't have enough experience with this dewormer, but from people who do have experience with it, they say that it works really well. But I haven't specifically asked if it works well against meningeal worm. And then there's a chemical dewormer, which is ivermectin, and that can be orally or injectable. I read that orally can be more effective, and you give this in the months that are most prevalent of the worm that you're worried about. So again, for meningeal worm, that'll probably be August through November. So the first one is a liquid. It's ivermectin sheep drench, which is 0.08% solution. This one would be a large volume. So for my 70-pound goat, I'd be giving this guy, I think it was like 17 mLs, which is a fair amount to give an animal orally, and I don't find that fun. And the dose would be 0.4 mg per kg. And I believe in this solution there's going to be 0.8 milligrams per ml. And then oral ivermectin also comes in a paste. And I personally would prefer giving this paste versus the liquid because it's a lot smaller of an amount. Okay, so here's the ivermectin paste. So it is 1.87% ivermectin. The dosing syringe tells you what to give for how heavy your animal is. It says 250 pounds, 500 pounds, and so on. This dose for the syringe, they're using 0.2 mg per kg, which is the same as 200 mics per kg. And we would be using 0.4 mg per kg. So essentially we'd be doubling the dose. So essentially a 250 pound animal would get up to here. So this would only treat a 125 pound animal. So Alpie's a little bit more than half of that. So his dose would be right here. So he's around 70 pounds. So I'll just write that here. So this is 0. This would be 125 pounds, 250 pounds, 375 pounds, 500. What is that? 625. And then there's injectable ivermectin, which is at the store you can get 1% ivermectin. And so you would get 0.3 mg per kg sub-Q once a month for those 4 months. And it's also important to note here that the reason that I didn't give ivermectin to Alpine is that ivermectin wasn't going to penetrate into the central nervous system to be able to kill these larvae. Ivermectin only works when it hasn't yet migrated to that point.